Hey you guys, it's Professor Smitherman-Brown. I'm here to provide some notes for Chapter 2. So I'm going to try a different format than I did in the first week, and that is to post these links to YouTube. As the chapters get a little bit longer and the content gets a little bit complex, the presentation of my notes will likely get a little bit longer, but feel free to check out the YouTube videos, pause as you need to, take a sip of water, take a break, and then come back to it. And remember always that I post just the slides for you as well, so if you prefer to go through the slides on your own, that's totally fine. You can also just read the book, and that's fine completely, but some students like to hear my narration and my overview. So to keep this information a little concise, a little bit shorter, I'm really going to spend time kind of going over more of the visual images that we cover in this course and some of the literature and music as well, but I won't spend a whole lot of time just reading notes and things to you. I'll refer you back to the slideshow and I'll refer you back to the textbook there to kind of keep these a little bit shorter. But in any case, we're starting this week with Chapter 2, and we start Chapter 2. We'll cover Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. And Chapter 2 is a pretty quick, short chapter to get through, and it's about critical thinking. So we'll start there. Of course, always refer to the learning objectives as you need to. But here we go. So the chapter really just begins with a quick overview of what is critical thinking. This is a term that we hear a lot, especially in college. All of your instructors probably want you to do this thing called critical thinking, and yet we don't spend a whole lot of time thinking critically about this term. So this chapter really encourages us to kind of slow down and look at what exactly that means. Critical thinking is basically gathering lots of information from multiple sources and looking at information objectively. And that means without a sort of emotional attachment to one side or the other, but trying to really approach information and news with a really unattached disposition. Excuse me. So it's the opposite of jumping to conclusions. With critical thinking, your conclusion should be based on evidence. You should have some support for your conclusions. Why do we need critical thinking? You can kind of read through this slide on your own, but really what's happening and what we're seeing here in the realm of higher education is that more and more employers are asking for students to graduate out of college and have a set of soft skills. So what that means is that employers are looking for students to have a set of skills in addition to whatever credentials that you need to get a job. So they're not just hiring people based on what degrees they have, but they're also beginning to look at whether people can think critically, whether they can think on their feet, whether they are adept at problem solving, whether they have good communication skills, good interaction with their peers. And so these are things that more and more institutions of higher education like TCC are looking at developing in students. So long story short, more and more jobs are asking for students who have critical thinking skills. Also, this is a really interesting article that you can access from the original slide posting, where it talks about people who have developed critical thinking skills end up having fewer negative life events that are associated with poor decision making. This could be life events such as having a vehicle that breaks down, having your utilities cut off, having failed relationships, failed marriages, unplanned pregnancies. And these were some really interesting statistics that came along in this article. Also, people with developed critical thinking skills, more creative, more successful in their jobs, less likely to have negative interactions with other people. That's a really important one. So one of the ways that we can begin to think critically is to understand that each one of us has a different way that we respond to our surroundings. We respond to our situations. And the book kind of parses this out into two types. One is called Apollonian and the other one is Dionysian. So our Apollonian response to situations is named for the god Apollo. The Dionysian response is named for the god Dionysus. So these are two Greek gods. Apollo is the god of sun and light and truth and rationality. So this is the part of us as humans who respond to situations in a very reasoned and analytical and rational and coherent way, right? So we think through everything and we come out with a rational solution. But we know as human beings that this is not entirely the way that we respond to situations. So sometimes we respond in the manner of this god Dionysius, who is the god of wine and intuition and spontaneity and emotion. So sometimes we respond to situations based on our gut feeling or a feeling of intuition or this idea that we're going to respond emotionally before we have a chance to think through things rationally. So everybody responds in one of these two ways. Some people respond more often in one way or the other. And of course, as the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche says, humans have both of these sides and they must figure out how to balance the two. So there's a time and a place for both of these types of responses. And so I just want to run through some images of art here that are said to represent either an Apollonian or a Dionysian viewpoint. And so this is Michelangelo's famous sculpture of David from the Italian Renaissance. And I would encourage you to look up some additional information about this sculpture. It's probably Michelangelo's most famous. And this is said to represent an Apollonian viewpoint, an Apollonian classicism. So there's a couple of reasons for this. One is that it depicts this story, this famous biblical story of David and Goliath. And if you don't know that story, you should do a quick Google search and get a little background information. I'll give you the very quick summary, which is that David is this young man in a village that is being harassed by this giant Goliath. And no one from the village will go out and defend the people from this giant. And so David sort of had enough. He's like this teenage kid, about 18, and he volunteers to go out and fight this Goliath. And in the story, David wins through really sizing up this situation, and he has a slingshot, and the slingshot is behind his shoulder, and he has a rock in his hand here, and he uses this slingshot to first stun the giant, and Goliath falls to the ground, and then he uses someone's sword to behead Goliath, and so he defeats him in this way. Understanding that he probably is not going to, just go out with a sword and defeat Goliath that way, that he needs a way to distract or stun this giant first. And so here we have this depiction of David before the action. So he still has the rock in his hand and he's looking very intensely. We can imagine that he's sizing up his enemy. He's trying to figure out the best course of action here. And so this represents a very rational response from this David as he's trying to figure out analytically how he's going to approach this situation. So let's contrast that with this version of the same subject by Donatello, who depicts this topic a little bit earlier than Michelangelo, about 60 years earlier, also from the Italian Renaissance. And in this version of David, we have a different moment in time being depicted. So this is after the action has occurred. And we know that because this David has the rock in his hand, but also has the sword in his right hand. And below him on the ground, you can barely make out here against the background, is the head of Goliath. So at this point, Goliath has been defeated. He's stepping on his head with his foot. And if we were to see this close up, we would see him actually tangling some of the hairs of the beard in his toes as he sort of very proudly triumphs over this defeated Goliath. So this is said to be the other side, the other sort of reaction. So here we have a David that's very young looking, very feminine looking, but is also very proud and maybe even a little bit cocky that he has defeated the giant Goliath. So this is a much more emotional, exuberant response to the situation here. So just to recap, we have this Apollonian response, this rational critical thinking that's taking place, and then we have this emotional response where he's very proud, almost on the verge of being cocky over his defeat of Goliath. So the book and the rest of the slides here, I'm not going to get into too much detail here because it's really outlined pretty well, but do make sure as you're going through each of the slides that you make sure to pay special attention to the underlined terms here, like popcorn syndrome, empathy, alienation. You're going to see these on the quiz for the week, and then also probably see them on the first unit exam, which we'll talk more about later. So yeah, this is pretty much it. You can go through these. I wanted to just make sure that we had a good covering of the 2 images from this chapter. And so we'll leave it here. Look through the rest of this on your own. Of course, as always, email me if you have any questions, and I'll see you all in chapter 3.